I think we can get started. It's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Naftali Wolfe making his debut on Torah Motion. So it's a pleasure. I want to thank Mark Shapiro, who in Italy mentioned that I should invite you to speak. We were schmoozing when he was in Stamford on Shavua, so thank him for making the introduction. Rabbi Wolfe, those who were here, heard he grew up in Chicago, attended Yeshiva University where he got his BA, his MA in medieval Jewish history, and smicha. And he was the rabbi of the Young Israel of Stamford, I believe. And today, I had never heard of the school. I just looked it up. It looks really cool. He teaches in
It
the,
exists.
let me get this right, the Bicultural Hebrew Academy of Connecticut. So I
That's
was
correct.
looking up, well, what does that mean? But anyways, it looks like a fascinating school. And bicultural, I see, was from started in the 50s, the best of American and Jewish culture. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Wolfe to Torah Motion. Vakasha. It's
Yeah.
okay. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Bicultural, it often throws people. They wonder, what are these two cultures supposed to be? My brother, when I told him he has made Aliyah for some time ago, so he's very much out of the American loop. He said, so it's American culture, right? I said, yeah. So he says Navi and NASCAR, right? So it's a fine pairing. There's a lot that American culture has to offer to us. We'll see how much we touch on that tonight. I suspect not all that much, but we'll find out. Actually, uh, we might veer in that direction. So there is a huge amount of material available online. Rabbi Kelman and I spoke about this last week. And I know that all of you have chosen to be here tonight and not simply to go to YU Torah or one of the other many fine Torah platforms that's available on the web and search for something canned, recorded, something that you can watch at your own pace, something you can fast forward through the boring parts. So you're all here with us, with myself, and I want to thank Rabbi Kelman for giving me the opportunity. And I would like to give you the option, please take it, of participating. I know that the standard format is to only leave questions for the end. My preference is for you to chime in either in the chat box or unmute yourself and just yell something out. You can use uh, the tools at the bottom to allow you to raise your hand. I'll try to keep an eye on the participants to see who has a hand raised to the best of my ability to do this. It's been some time since I had to teach on Zoom. I am a high school teacher in my regular life. So it's been a good almost 5 years since we were in the heart of the COVID pandemic when we all went on to remote teaching. But I haven't completely forgotten the skills. So that's all by way of introduction. My Kalman says Naftali Wolfe. I live in Stamford, Connecticut. I teach Judaics at a high school level. I have been teaching for quite some time, been in Jewish education basically my entire adult life. This format of teaching strangers is a little bit new for me. I don't know basically any of you as far as I know, but I hope to get acquainted either tonight or in some other future opportunity that we'll have to get to know each other. So if I say something that sounds crazy, let me know. If I say something that sounds idiotic, also let me know. And then we'll be able to move forward from there. So I want to start with a question, and I would like answers, but if you don't give them, I'll just give my own. And by way of introduction to the question, let me give a media parallel. There was a movie that came out some time ago, early 2000s, called Unbreakable. And the movie had Bruce Willis and I think it was Samuel L. Jackson in it. It was a movie about a superhero. And in the movie, Bruce Willis's character was as the title implies, he was unbreakable. There was nothing that he could do to break his bones, his body. He was invincible. And without meaning to give away too much of the ending of the movie, it turns out that the nemesis that he has exactly the opposite problem. So in order for there to be balance in the universe, we need on the side of good something that has one strength, and on the side of evil, there has to be something with an equal, corresponding, but diametrically opposed strength. So if we look at the characters in Tanakh, and we'll stick with the main focus of the week, of course, is the Parsha of Devarim. But if we look at the characters in Tanakh, sometimes we can see this neatly, and sometimes it's less obvious, where there are pairs of heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, in some cases super villains, nemesis that we can find. So let me start with, I don't know if this is an obvious one or not, but I'll throw one out there. All right, so if we give you the
Goliath.
character of Agag.
David and Goliath.
All right. David and Goliath. Excellent. Right. So David and Goliath is a fine grouping, right? Now, David has a strength and Goliath has a strength, right? So Chaim Fruchter, I think, was the one who shouted that one out. Can you elaborate? Why those two?
Why those two? Because one represents us and one represents the opposite, and one has physical strength and the other one probably not, but he pretend to have, and that's why he gets the mission, but he does not qualify or not a match to Goliath.
Right. So it's a fantastic example. And I'll just elaborate for another second, and it will directly tie into where I want to go tonight as well. David and Goliath are presented as opposites in the text. David is tiny, Goliath is enormous. David is weak, Goliath is huge. David has no military training. Goliath is the exemplar of everything that the Plishti army can offer. Goliath, even you may remember, he refers to David as he refers to himself when looking at David as a ridicule shows as what am I, a dog that you've sent me out to sport with me, and the Midrash actually goes even farther than that in an effort to try to create parallels between these two characters and tells us that we know very well who David's ancestry is. That is established for us firmly at the end of the book of Ruth. We are told that David comes from the tribe of Judah, but more than that, we're told that his great-grandmother was Ruth. Ruth was from Moab. And the beginning of that story, which I'm sure you'll remember, is that Ruth lives in Moab together with her sister-in-law Orpah, and Ruth goes back to the land of Israel, the land of Judah, with her mother-in-law, and Orpah does not. And Midrash, I think it's cited by Rashi in Megillat Ruth, tells us that when Orpah went back to Moab, and decided to stay there, that very night she had intercourse with many men, and the result of that was Goliath. Now what the Midrash is doing is exactly what Mr. Fruchter, Dr. Fruchter, Rabbi Fruchter, I'm not sure, just suggested. He tells us that we have these two characters, and it's not enough to just see them facing off. What we want to see is that their origin stories are the same but opposite. Their strengths are the same but opposite. It's much better for narrative purposes when you have supervillains and superheroes who make sense as a pairing, right? And the end of that story is that David does the unexpected. He uses this little rock to knock Goliath in his head and then cuts off his head with Goliath's own sword using his own strength against him. That is the end of the story over there. What's interesting, though, is that that's not the end of the story as far as the Navi is concerned, because the vestiges of that story continue throughout the rest of the book of Shmuel, as we will talk about soon. So that's a great example, right? Let's think about another one. Any other examples? Anybody want to shout one out? Where we have a pairing of a good guy and a bad guy, where we can see their strengths as equal but opposite.
Avraham and Bilam.
Oh, we got a few. All right. So somebody other than Mr. Fruchter.
Yaakov and Lavan.
Yaakov and Lavan. Now, I would have said Yaakov and Esau, right? Why do you say Yaakov and Lavan?
Because one has the power over the other, and he has the evil, and Yaakov is subservient to Lavan, but he is good. And he has to get out from under his thumb in order to become the superhero that he is, the father of all of us.
That's wonderful, right? And what we can see in the text of Bereshit, which we are going to look not at that particular chapter, but when we look at the story of Yaakov and Lavan at the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, what we see is exactly what you're saying, right? It's necessary for Yaakov to go through the experience with Lavan, who calls himself Lavan, white and innocent and pure, but is of course nothing but deceitful throughout the entire time there, in order to learn the skills that will be necessary for the rest of his life. But I'll go even a step farther than that, because you'll remember, I'm sure, that in the beginning of the story with Yaakov and Lavan, Yaakov comes to Haran and he's looking for Lavan. He's looking for his uncle, right? And what he finds is instead Rachel coming with the sheep, and the shepherds there tell him. And if you remember the scene, he sees that there's this giant rock on top of the well, and the people tell him that they need to gather together before they can move the rock, right? So you have this model that exists in Haran, which is one type of way of living in which the only way that anything could ever happen is by uniform consensus. And Yaakov comes in, and what does he do? Everybody remembers. He pushes off the rock all by himself, right? So it sets himself up clearly as the superhero. Lavan's superpower, such as it is in the text, is his ability to create consensus amongst the people of Haran. And Yaakov's superpower, such as it is in the text, is his ability to defy the conventions of the land of Haran. So it's a fantastic example also. You could see Yaakov and Esav also in a much more obvious way, where the Torah really does a lot to sort of highlight their contrasts, and the Midrashim go even farther than that. Look at one more example, and then we'll move forward. I heard somebody else shouting out before. So if you wouldn't mind sharing it now.
Rabbeinu.
I didn't catch that one. That was Mr. Hepner, I think. Not getting it. He said Moshe Rabbeinu, I think. And who? So let me put that one out there as a question. Moshe Rabbeinu and who? Who's on the opposite side of that equation? Who is the antithesis of Moshe?
Bilam.
Bilam, right? Excellent, right? So we have the character of Bilam, which interestingly, he's called Bilam ben Beor. According to at least one view in the Gemara, that Beor is in fact Lavan himself, right? Coming back around for a second showing in the text. And the two of them, the Midrash tells us they have equal prophetic powers, right? One of them uses it for good and the other one uses it for evil, right? Now, once again, just like I said before to whoever had suggested, I'm sorry, I don't really know you well, but I thought it was a fine point about Yaakov and Lavan. There's a more obvious one, right? Yaakov has an adversary in the text, which is Esav. And Moshe has an adversary in the text, which is obviously
Paro.
right?
Korach.
And
Korach.
Okay, fantastic, right? So let me run through each one of these, and I'm going to show you that there's actually, aside from Bilam, who we can see as an anti-Moshe from a very specific lens, and aside from Paro, who for the narrative purposes, of course, in the the Prince of Egypt retelling, obviously is set up as the anti-Moshe. And if you remember the Prince of Egypt, which I can't use as a source of authority, but it is certainly a connection point that most people will be familiar with. You'll remember that they show Moshe and Paro, Ramses, that is, growing up together in the palace and sort of diverging at some point and then coming back together. So aside from that one, and aside from Korach, right? Now, Korach is a great option where we see very explicitly, right? He comes to Moshe and he says, "Madua titnasu al kal Hashem," right? You have, this claim that you're better than all of us. And I say, I know exactly what you know, right? I'm also descended from Levi. I am also an important person in this nation. I also have the minds and the hearts of the people with me. And I know what Hashem wants, right? Not that he can claim to speak to Hashem, but he can say, I don't need to, right? I have insight that comes not from Hashem. Now, in each one of these, right, we have a character. We'll go back to the examples that we cited over here, Yaakov and Lavan, David and Goliath, Moshe and Korach, Moshe and Bilam, Moshe and Paro, whatever it might be, where we can hone in on some specific thing and we say, each one of these people have an adversary. And in that adversity, the Torah shows us how we are supposed to think about the hero. We understand David better because of the existence of Goliath. We understand Yaakov much better because of the existence of Lavan, and we understand Moshe better, not so much because of Paro, that one is more for the narrative, but certainly we understand Moshe much better because of Bilam and because of Korach, right? And without those storylines, we would be missing something fundamental in understanding what the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moshe, is all about. We've been missing something in understanding what Moshe's leadership style was all about. We've been missing something in understanding what is it that made David such a great king, right? And why it was that his lineage mattered. So let me show you that there is actually another character, a much, much less likely character, who's presented in Midrashim as an adversary for not just Moshe, but actually almost all of the major characters in the Torah. And it's very, very, very surprising. It's something that, has bothered me for a long time. And I'm not going to say that I have answers as such, but I have sort of, we'll call it an approach for understanding why it is that Chazal create this character into something that he appears to be virtually nothing like from the text, and what it is they're trying to achieve. My Tanakh teacher in college at YU, Rabbi Shalom Karmi, who I'm sure has been quoted in many a Torah in Motion shir, perhaps even he's been given a Torah in Motion shir. I don't know. I didn't do so much homework to find out. He had a line that he liked to say. I don't know if it was his own, but I only heard it from him. That sometimes the midrash on the midrash is the pshat. In other words, when we look behind the midrashim, when we don't accept midrashay agada at face value and just say, the Midrash is telling us that Avram smashed the idols because we need an origin story, but instead ask the question, really, what is the Midrash really getting at over here? Why is it important for us to understand Avram's origin through that idol story, which is not what I'm talking about now, but it's a well-known Midrash. Then we get much closer to understanding what's really going on in the Psukim in the 12th chapter and the 11th chapter of the book of Bereshit, right? So we're going to look here, since this is supposed to be a Parshat Devarim share. We're going to look at some Psukim in Devarim and try to understand what Chazal saw in these Psukim, what it is that the sages were looking for, what they were looking at when they read the words, and when they saw meaning that is in some ways invisible to the casual reader, but in other ways, maybe even more important ways, should be accessible to all of us. And there's really a lot going on behind the scenes. So let's before we actually get into the characters here, let's talk about what Moshe is doing in the book of Devarim and in Parshat Devarim in particular. So we've already been through at this point 4 books of the Torah. We started with Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim va'aretz. We were told how we go from nothing to something. From the beginning of Bereshit until the end, we were told how it is that the beginnings of Am Yisrael get formed, right? How the world comes into being, and then everything that's familiar to us is around. That happens by the beginning of the 9th chapter of Bereshit. Maybe you could push it to the 11th, depending on how you want to read it. Then we understand the connection to the land of Canaan. We get down to Mitzrayim. Certainly that's what Bereshit is mostly getting us towards. We get into the book of Shemot. Shemot gets us out of Mitzrayim. Vayikra tells us how to live, but Midbar tells us how to move towards the land of Israel, and then that gets disrupted. Why does the book of Devarim even need to exist at all? We could have gone very, very neatly from the last psukim in the book of Midbar, right? The last psukim of Midbar talk about, the second to last chapter, that is, talk about dividing the land of Israel amongst the Shvatim. It talks about setting up the cities of refuge. The Torah talks about how those cities are supposed to be coordinated, not just the cities of refuge themselves, but also there's a whole urban planning model that the Torah exposes us to. I was talking with a good friend who's an architect on Friday night last week. He said that Parshat Maaseh is his favorite parsha in the entire Torah. It's the only place where urban planning and environmental considerations are brought in to the mitzvot of the Torah. There's at least 2 mitzvot that the Torah gives us about how to design cities. So if we went from there, and then the very last chapter of Bamidbar tells us that the members of the tribe of Menashe, they came and they asked for, a new rule about intermarriage amongst the tribes. If we went from that chapter to the very last psukim in the book of Devarim, in which Moshe is now standing at Har Nevo, he looks into the land and he says to Hashem, I would love to go there. And Hashem says to him, sorry, not going to happen. You're stuck on this side of the river. And then Moshe died. We'd be fine. We have a new leader, which is Yeshua. We have our Shvatim all divided. We have our census taken. We have a very clear picture about what exactly is supposed to happen. We have not been given detailed rules for warfare, but that's fine. I mean, the Torah could have, implied them and then given them to Yeshua through a Torah Shebaal Peh style. As we'll see, some of the rules were pretty ambiguous and therefore had to be interpreted later anyway. There are certainly many mitzvot in the book of Devarim, but as Ramban tells us in his introduction to the book, all of those mitzvot are simply elaborations on other mitzvot that existed beforehand. So why does this book exist at all? And we understand very well that the book of Devarim is one of the 5 books of the Torah. It's part of the Torah Sinai that is given from Hashem directly to Moshe. And even though the language of the book is different from the rest of the Torah, as far as, the V'yedaber Hashem al Moshe kind of style that you have in the rest of the Torah, we understand very well that this is part of the Torah. So it's of necessity. It's not Moshe's creation just for kicks. So why does it exist at all?
I claim that it's Cain Benot Tzofchad Dovrot. The word Dovrot anticipates Sefer Devarim, which is Moshe's legacy to Bnei Israel, instead of his 2 sons, Gershom and Eliezer.
This is an interesting suggestion. I'm gonna play with for a second.
I have a poem. I have a poem on that in Jewish.
A poem.
Yes, in Jewish Journal. If you look it up,
I will. It's a fascinating idea. I may ask you to elaborate in a moment, but let me just think about it for a second. So the Torah back in the 26th chapter of Bamidbar told us that Moshe is in conversation with the Benot Tzlafchad, and they say, Cain Benot Tzlafchad, right? Hashem tells them, Cain Benot Tzlafchad Dovrot. The words that are coming from them, they are effectively divinely inspired, right? In the same way that you are usually told to be a Deber Hashem al Moshe, they are speaking with the same level of authority. So now you, Moshe, and what they're asking for is Lama Nigara, right? Why should we be, Lama Nigara Shem Avinu, the wrong pasuk. Why should our father's legacy be less? And they see the legacy as only being transmittable through direct descendants and expressed through holding on to land. And Moshe shows us that there's another way of expressing legacy. Am I getting the idea correct, Mr. Hefner? Is that approximately right? Rabbi, doctor, I'm not sure. Professor? Did I get it? I'm not sure if that's what you're going for, if it's something different. Not getting a response. All right, it's fine.
You got it right. You got it absolutely right.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. And you know what? I will see if I can incorporate some of it into the thoughts that I also had about what the Torah is really doing with this
Check
book.
out my poem in the Jewish Journal
I most certainly will. When is it from? Is it recent or is it sometime in the
last week.
Oh, well, that's very recent. Okay, fantastic. All right, we're fresh off the hot off the presses here. Torah in motion is coming alive. All right, so let's refocus for a second. Now, this is a clever approach, but it only gets us the bedrock. It doesn't get us all the way to understanding the details of what's happening in the book, because even if we're willing to say, and I am perfectly willing to say that Moshe, as obviously a Levi, has no stake in the land, and with his own sons turning out to be, as far as we can tell, largely disappointments, maybe even worse than that, he has to establish something that will be his lasting legacy. Now, there's already 4 books of the Torah in which Moshe is hardly a bit player. He takes center stage, but nonetheless, the Book of Devarim is Moshe's own words. Elai Devarim Asher Diber Moshe Aladat Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe himself spoke to the people, and that then cements the message that he wants for them. I'm not going to dispute this. I think that it's an excellent approach. But let me try to hone in on one particular detail. If we were to try to sum up what Moshe is really telling them, what is the message, right? So, you've implied here beautifully that there's a legacy that Moshe wants to accomplish, wants to attain through the Book of Devarim. And I wonder if we might be able to hone in on some very, very specific word that gives us exactly what the legacy of Moshe is. I have one, but I'm wondering if you or anybody else has a different one. Anybody want to suggest one? So I'll give you mine. And it's here in the 30th chapter of the Book of Devarim, and you'll see that it's also in the first chapter, although not necessarily in so many words. This is going a little bit out of order for the way I wanted to do things, but it's all good. So the Book of Devarim is essentially one long speech for the first 30 chapters. Moshe starts, it says, Moshe speaks to the people. He tells them in that speech some of their history which starts with Ma'amad Har Sinai, but not really. It starts instead with a selection of judges that preceded Ma'amad Har Sinai. And then he goes into the sin of Meraglim. What was it that led them to be in the desert for so long? Some of the wars they have already fought, and culminates that segment by telling them about, reminding them about the Egel HaZahav. In this, he gives them messages like Shema, very well-known psukim. He gives them messages like V'haya im Shemoah, consequences for observing and not observing mitzvot. He gives them many, many, many details. Ela mishpatim v'chukim asher tishmeru la'asot ba'aretz. These are the mitzvot that you have to observe when you come into the land of Israel. And that happens up until around chapter 25. Then in chapter 26, we get a change where Moshe speaks about what the experience of living in Israel will be like. And as part of that, he gives them blessings and curses. So one could say that is really the focus. But I think that there's another thing over here. Here is the end, really the end of Moshe's speech. The first verb that appears in the book of Devarim happens here in chapter 31. Vayelech Moshe v'yidaber Devarim ha'el kol Yisrael. This is the first action word that we have in the entire book, where Moshe actually leaves where he was standing and he goes somewhere. 30 chapters, he's standing in one spot. And in that one spot, he culminates with this message. He tells them that they're going into the land, which was, let me actually turn on the translation over here as well, so you can see it that way for those for whom it is easier. He tells them they're going into the land that was promised to their forefathers, and when they get in there, they have to love Hashem. But that's not the beginning of the sentence. The beginning of the sentence is, you know what your choices are. Ubacharta b'chayim leman tichya ata v'zarecha. You must choose life. Ubacharta b'chayim. So a small little point on this. My son, whose picture is behind me, is God willing going to have his bar mitzvah on Parshat Nitzavim this year. He's in summer camp now, but he'll be back shortly, and hopefully he's practicing his laning while he's over there. He's going to have his bar mitzvah on Parshat Nitzavim. I was practicing the laning with him, and he read this as a reasonable person would. Ubacharta bichayim leman tichiyata v'zarecha. You shall choose life. in order that you and your children should live. But that's not what the pasuk says, right? Now, I know this how it translates it over here, but I'm not sure you can even see it on the screen share, but if you look carefully over here, it says, Ubacharta ba'chayim. Now, there's an important grammatical difference between bichayim and ba'chayim. This patach, right, the line underneath the bet, it changes the word. It doesn't mean choose life. It means choose the life, right? In other words, there's a specific kind of life that Moshe has been communicating to the people throughout this entire book. And now at the end of it, he says to them, I have given you all of the tools that you need. Now it is time for you to choose. Ubacharta ba'chayim. I think that is the legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu, more than anything else. And what I'm going to show you now is that needed to be the legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe's own history, as the Midrash shows us, tells him that focusing on choice, ubacharta b'chayim, I mean, you might call this pro-life and pro-choice in the same words, if you are inclined to make such lame political jokes. But you can see, right, that Moshe's focus is on choosing a very specific kind of life. Now, why did he get there? So let's go back to what actually happens at the beginning of the book, over here. So Moshe is speaking to the people, and he tells them, when you were gathered there together near Har Sinai, in the days leading up to the actual revelation, and I'm going to go with sort of what I think is the easier interpretation of the text, not the one that Rashi provides in this case, I told you at the time that you had to judge, and that when you judged, you had to judge fairly. And when you were judging fairly, there were certain things that you had to do. When you're choosing, when you're judging, that is, judge honestly. Make sure that whether it be people who know each other or people who are strangers, whether they both be, as you can see from the language of the simple read of the text, whether they're all Bnei Israel or whether you have some non-citizen aliens who are part of the judgment, either way, judge honestly, judge fairly. And then the second pasuk, Lo takiru panim b'mishpat, kekatan lo tishma'un. Be honest about everything, whether it's small or large. And we have these words, Lo taguru mipnei ish, ki hamishpat le'elokim hu. Do not taguru mipnei ish, ki hamishpat le'elokim hu. Do not, whatever this words mean. Now, this word, taguru, right, as you can see from the previous pasuk, we know the word taguru, right, lagur, is to live in a place. Clearly, that cannot be what it means in this context. If lo taguru mipnei ish means don't make yourself a resident or live amongst people, that makes no sense. So what does this word mean over here? Lo taguru mipnei ish. Now look at the translation that we provided over here. Fear neither party. Lo taguru mipnei ish. Do not be afraid of anybody. Do not be afraid. Ki hamishpat le'elokim hu. Right? Moshe says to them, just remember you have this fail-safe that if you of the judges can't figure something out, then you can come back to me. So now, this is a mitzvah. Lo taguru mipnei ish. It's a mitzvah. Lo ta'aseh, a negative commandment in the Torah. The Torah is telling us something over here. Moshe Rabbeinu is giving a mitzvah to the people, telling them that when they're in court, you cannot be overly afraid. Now, what does it mean, lo taguru mipnei ish? Here we have a sifrei. The sifrei is Midrash Halacha. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it. It is, the rabbis at the time, roughly the time of the Mishnah, slightly before, deriving laws from the language of the Torah. There's specific hermeneutic, very simple read of the words. Torah says, Lo taguru mipnei ish, do not be afraid mipnei ish, right, because of a man. I'm getting the message that my internet connection is unstable. I'm not sure why. Anybody having glitching or anything like that?
You had like a 5-second where it wasn't good, but it's fine. Otherwise,
it's all right now?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let me just repeat for a couple of seconds then. So the Torah here, right, tells us that Lo taguru mipnei ish, do not be afraid because of ish, because of a man. Well, the translation that I showed you before kind of equalizes this by just saying, what does a man mean in this context? It just means the parties, right? Ish is a generic term to tell you that it's just talking about the litigants in any given case. But that's not how the Midrash Halacha reads it, right? There's a specific injunction here. Shema Torah mityarei miploni. The ish in question is a specific man, the kind of person that you might be afraid of. Shema yargat b'ni, or shema yadlika gedashi, or shema netiotai, right? It's possible that if I render an unfavorable judgment against this particular litigant, he's going to kill my son. Or maybe he'll light my granary on fire, or cut down my plants.
We have Vayar ki ein ish when Moshe.
Beautiful, right? So that expression, right? They're using the term ish to mean something. The kind of person who's willing to take action is beautifully validated in that particular instance, which is really right at the beginning of Moshe Rabbeinu's own story. The reference that you should tell me, is it Mr. Rabbi Dr. Hepner, or should I just call you Gershon? I don't know. We're gonna go with Gershon. That'll make it easier. All right. What Gershon is alluding to is the pasuk right at the beginning of the book of Shemot, right in the second parak, right after Moshe is old enough to leave the house of Paro. He goes out and he sees that there is a Ish Mitzri who is striking one of the fellow Israelites. V'yifen kova kova yarki ein ish v'yachet ha-Mitzri v'yitmeneo b'chol. Right. What he does is he takes action. Yarki ein ish. No one else is going to take action. Now you look at the language over here, right? An ish is a person who takes action. Now in this case, the action that is taken by the ish is most definitely unjustified. It's terrible actions, right? It's threatening the judge with retribution for doing the right thing. But the Torah here tells you why you cannot do that. Not just because it means that the system will fail, and not just because we can't allow vigilantes, it's not even vigilantes really, it's just mafiosos, to create the laws for us, because there is something else going on over here. God is in charge. Straightforward read of this Midrash Halacha says, fear is on one side, and on the opposite side is truth. Now, you might think that fear is a convenient out. You, as the judge, might say, and we'll talk more about how the Halacha understands this at the end of our time together tonight, you might say to yourself, I don't need to go with an honest judgment because clearly my own well-being needs to be taken into account as well. And even though it might be dishonest for me to say that John Gotti should be acquitted for the millionth time, well, what's my other choice? If I don't do that, then clearly the negative consequences are going to be awful. So, I might as well. And what the halacha is saying over here is it's not your choice. You as the judge are the representative of Hashem, Mishpat Elokim Hu, and you can't misrepresent the ways of Hashem. Now, the word that is used over here, though, again, lo taguru mipnei ish, do not be afraid. Why is Moshe talking about fear here, right? Torah could have communicated the exact same notion without talking about fear. It simply could have said, which it does say, right? Judge honestly. It simply could have said, midvar sheker tirchad. When Rambam codifies this law in the Mishnah Torah, he actually cites this pasuk immediately adjacent to midvar sheker tirchad. Do not tell lies. Because the other option over here is to be dishonest. Why talk about fear at all? And I think that one of the things that we're seeing over here is that the usage of the word, this shoresh in particular, this gimel resh, probably it's gimel resh, resh, shoresh, which implies the word fear, is used because this is on Moshe's mind at this particular moment. And I don't say this without evidence, right? This next verse is not particularly germane, but it's just another case where we see the word vayagar to mean fear. It's a fine use case. It's a very rare conjugation in Tanakh. It's a fun one, specifically because of the David and Goliath reference that you made before, because here you see in the immediate aftermath of David killing Goliath, Shaul's reaction is vayagar mipanav, right? He knows that there's more to the story that's yet to come. So we'll come back to that in a second. Okay.
Taguru is also the root of the name Gershom, who was the ancestor of Yonatan ben Menashe.
Correct.
Son of Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yes. Going to the end of the book of Shoftim. Yes, correct. Although etymologically, I'm going to possibly say that these things are not related, but we'll see when we have time to explore. So why is Moshe afraid? Right? Where is this fear coming from? What is Moshe's understanding of what fear is all about? So let's take a step back for a second and go back to the book of Bamidbar, to the events, the narrative events that lead us up to the book of Devarim. Now, the very last thing that happens, as I mentioned, is this negotiation with the Benot Slavchad. But that comes out of a series of events that started back in the 21st chapter of the book of Bamidbar. In the 20th chapter of Bamidbar is the story of Moshe hitting the rock. Very well-known story, of course, when Moshe is told that he's not going to go into the land of Israel. The 21st chapter is when Moshe, now having accepted that he's not going into the land of Israel, starts moving forward towards Israel anyway and fights some wars. fights a war against Sichon and a war against Og, right? And in the war against Sichon, Sichon and Og are both kings of the Emori. In the war against Sichon, Moshe simply sends his messengers to Sichon. Sichon is not interested in any kind of peace negotiations. Moshe goes out to battle with them, and they decimate the people of Sichon, killing as many as is necessary in order for them to move forward. And then we have this war against Og. And for some reason, when Moshe is facing off against Og, the Torah tells us that Moshe is afraid, or it implies it anyway. Moshe, Al tira oto, right? The Torah tells us that Moshe is afraid of Og. What is Moshe afraid of? Now, Og, I'm sure you guys know, is described here in the book of Devarim, in the 3rd chapter of Devarim, as an enormous person, right? We're told that he was the last one of the Rephaim. Here's a fine Christian image, which gives us a nice picture of Og as a giant. I don't know what he's holding in the, I think it's a stick or something there. But, it gives us some sense of the proportions. These are not the ones that we find in the Talmud. This is maybe a 10% of the scale of Og as we find in the Gemara. Og is described as being this absolutely monstrous character, right? A giant of epic proportions. The thing about Og is that his entire storyline occurs in really just a couple of psukim, right? Og is here in Bamidbar 21, and Og shows up again in Devarim chapter 3, and that's basically it, right? That's it. We don't find a lot of other references to him in the Torah. We don't find a lot of references to him in Tanakh, right? Really only one other. It's really the same exact context. We're told that the land of Og, the land of the Bashan, was taken over by Bnei Israel. It was not originally part of the land of Canaan, but was taken over by Bnei Israel. I think that the Bashan, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about this, was in the news a lot recently, and that's where the massacre of the Druze took place. And so if you are thinking geographically, it's not exactly Israel, right? It's adjacent to Israel, but it's a territory that still today is a contested area, right? But I'm sure that most of you know that in the Midrashim, Og becomes something very, very different. He's not just the king of this territory that Moshe has to fight with. He's not just the last of these great mighty people, great warriors, chieftains who are part of these tribal affiliations in that region. He's something else. He's some ancient character who's been around and around and around forever, right?
He's a Palit, a refugee, like
the Palit.
refugees today.
Okay. So now, here we have Rashi.
Hangover from the flood.
Aha, fantastic. We've got, so yes, you're all giving me the fine midrashim that you all know. Now, here's the question, right? And we're running relatively short on time, so I might have to expedite a few sources over here. Why do Chazal create this character of Og to be something other than what he is in the text? Where do they get the license to do this? Now, this is where we come to the Midrash on the Midrash approach, right? So here, I'll just take a glance at some of these Midrashim. First one over here, quoted by Rashi. Why was he so afraid? Because this Og is the Palit, the survivor of the war, which we'll talk about shortly, in the 14th chapter of the book of Bereshit, who escapes the battle when the Mesopotamian kings come into the land of Canaan. He escapes and he tells Abraham that his nephew Lot has been taken captive, right? He's the last one left over. And so that's a zechut, that's a credit to him that he did that thing that one time. Now, just think about the timeline here for a second, right? That's hundreds of years before this, no matter how you slice it. Og would have to be extremely old, right? According to the Midrash, which we'll look at in a second, he's over 500 years old at this point, right? But he goes back even farther. As somebody mentioned just a second ago also, that Og is described as holding on to the outside of the Teva. And here I'll just show you the translation of this cute source from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, that Og is the only one who's there, right? King of the Bashan. He's standing on a piece of wood and holding on to the outside of the Teva, right? And Noach sees him there, pokes a little hole through and gives him his food out the window of the Teva. What on earth is the Midrash doing here, right? More, right? The Midrash say, what else do we know about Og, right? Well, aside from the fact that he was there telling Avraham about Lot, and aside from the fact that he was there at the time of the Teva, he's also there at the birth of Yitzchak. And he's also there at the circumcision of Abraham. And he's also there when Yaakov is speaking to Paro, right? We don't have time to go through all this midrash. If you're interested, the citation is here, Devarim Rabbah 125, right? He's there every time. He's always there in the backdrop, and he's always there causing little problems for whoever our character is. What gives Chazal this license to take this character who is such a bit player in the book of Bamidbar, single reference in the book of Devarim, and turn him into this ever-present alter ego of all of our great heroes? Now, if you have answers to this question, I'm interested in hearing them. Yeah, go ahead.
He would have survived the Migdal Bavel and Nimrod as well.
Why not? If there was a midrash that justified this, I would say put him back into the Gan Eden as well, right? Let him be there to, so he's standing there together with the snake, as they're eating from the Eitz Hadat Tov Hara. Yeah, he's there, right? He's always there. The midrashim put him everywhere. It's like that Woody Allen movie. It was called Zelig, right? Where he just shows up at every scene in history. There's a surveying the scene. What gives them the license to do this? Chazal do not make things up arbitrarily, right? Now, the simple answer to this, which is a terrible answer, is that he's called the Palit, the survivor, right? And as the survivor, he's the permanent survivor. It's like having a designated hitter in baseball. So he's just always there. And if you want to be, lame about it and go for an approach which tells us nothing, you just call it midrashic conservation of personality. Anytime that they can tell you more about something, they will, right? But this is worse than that, because these are stories that don't need to exist at all, right? The Palit who comes to Avram doesn't have to be mentioned. There's no indication in the text that somebody just survives the flood. Now, I mean, we understand why it is that they want this giant man to have been from some other era, but what is going on here? So we have to take a step to the side for a second in order to understand this story, which will tell us about fear, which will tell us about what nemesis are, and will tell us why it is that Moshe is so focused on honesty in court. We're going to get an answer to all these questions. In order to do it, we have to look back at the 14th chapter of the book of Bereshit. In the 14th chapter of Bereshit, we have what seems to be a major digression from the text. So the Torah had told us, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, so whatever, I'll keep the share going, it's fine. The Torah had told us in the 12th chapter of Bereshit that Avram had come to the land of Canaan, Lech lecha me'artzecha. The Torah had told us that Avram was now in the process of trying to set up home in Canaan. When a famine struck, he went down to Egypt. In the 13th chapter, Avram comes back from Egypt to Canaan, and he comes with a bunch of stuff. In that same chapter, Avram and Lot, psukim that we'll look at in just a second. Actually, let me just go ahead to them right now, actually. Avram and Lot split. There's a fight between them. We'll talk about what that fight was about in just a second. And Avram doesn't want to fight with Lot. Tells him, "Anashim achim anachnu," right? We're brothers. We shouldn't fight. Instead, you go your way, I'll go mine. And Lot ends up going to the city of Sodom. In the 14th chapter of Bereshit, we have this war. In the 15th chapter, we go back to Avram. And Avram says, I don't have any children. I've only got domestic Eliezer as the only alliance that I have. Another midrash, by the way, says that Eliezer is none other than Og, right? Just to really seal the deal that Og is always there. And Avram says, this is not good enough for me. I need something more. And then we have the Brit Ben Abitarim, where Avram is told that that they'll go down to the land of Egypt, sort of setting the stage for the remainder of the book of Bereshit and the entire book of Shemot, and I guess the rest of the Torah also, possibly the rest of Tanakh. So that's chapter 15, and that was chapter 13. Chapter 14 is the geopolitics of the time. We're told, and here's the little map that does a fine job of illustrating it, right? We're told that a bunch of kings from over here in can you see my little cursor moving? I'm not sure if you can. It doesn't matter.
We can.
We can. Good. Right. Excellent. Thank you. So you see over here that these kings who are from over here, right? Fertile Crescent. They start. They make an effort to conquer the land of Canaan. Right. We're told there are 4 kings from there. Powerful kings of what would be empires, that are interested in spreading their influence into the land of Canaan. As Kedar Omer appears to be the leader of the entire group. And they come primarily to Sodom. And when they come to Sodom, They encounter Avram's nephew Lot, who they take captive. Avram then has to rescue him, and the Psukim tell us pretty clearly that Avram is very successful when he rescues Lot. He chases them all the way, very, very far from where they were in Sodom, all the way north until Mismola Damasek, right? Far out of the area where they were, chasing them totally out of the land of Canaan. Why is this story in the book of Bereshit at all? It doesn't really have anything to do with Avram. It's not particularly important to the life of the Avot. There are no mitzvot contained in it. There's not a lot of moralizing in it. I guess from the end of the story, we have Avram saying that he's not willing to take any of the spoils of war. So we can see Avram distancing himself from the king of Sodom. But there's very little in this story which is essential for the book of Bereshit. Why is it here? So I'll give you my theory. The Torah here wants us to know that Abraham is not the same as these kings. If you look at the geography here, right? Here are these kings. They migrate across from this area, from Ur Kasdim, which is right here, which is Avram's home originally, and they move across here to Haran, and then they come south into the land of Canaan. Now, Avram did exactly the same thing, only some years before this, right? Avram did exactly the same thing. And Avram comes into the land of Canaan, and he comes in and says, this is going to be mine. This land, this is the one that Hashem has promised to me. Right? This is the land that Hashem has shown to me, and I'm going to give it to you. Now, how is this different from what these other kings are doing? They come into this land and they say, we have Mesopotamian superiority, right? We're coming into this land of Canaan, this backwater where people are undeveloped, living tribally, living, with no meaningful developments in technology, right? And we see this whole land of Canaan is just wasted on these Canaanites. We, with our enlightened attitudes from the Mesopotamian, developed world, we're going to come in and we're going to Mesopotamianize this region. It's going to be great, right? Everyone will be the beneficiary of this. This is colonialism in the modern sense, but in the ancient world, this is just de rigueur, right? That somebody with a more powerful place comes to a weaker place. They see resources and decide to exploit them. How is Abraham different? And let's make this point even stronger. Why do they go to Sodom? Why do they go to Sodom out of all places in Canaan? What makes Sodom so appealing? The Torah tells us what makes Sodom so appealing, right? It doesn't tell us in the 14th chapter, but it tells us in the 13th chapter why Sodom is so appealing. Sodom is appealing because Sodom is like Mesopotamia. It's fertile, right? Sodom of today, Sodom after it's destroyed by the Gafrit Vamelach, right? That rained down in the destruction of Sodom is nothing like Mesopotamia. It's worthless. But Sodom at the time is the place that if you were Mesopotamian coming into this region, this is the place that would make the most sense to you. By way of analogy, think about the Dutch.
It's also like Mitzrayim.
Yes. The Torah describes it as Kigan Hashem Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, right? As fertile as Mitzrayim. Now, in the context of the Psukim of chapter 13, that makes sense because that's our reference point back in chapter 12. But in the context of chapter 14, the reference that we should give to it, because Mitzrayim and Mesopotamia are not drastically different from each other in terms of fertility, right? The framework that we should give it is the other land that's watered by the rivers, which is Mesopotamia. So they come there because it seems like home. But they're not the first ones to do that. The first person that we see in the Torah who comes into Canaan and says, oh, this place feels like home is Lot. Lot had done exactly that in the previous chapter, right? What he had done is he had gone to Sodom. Now let's take this one step further. Now this is where we're coming. Everything I've told you right now, I think is undeniably just a simple read of the Psukim. Here's where we get into the creative portion of this analysis. Why did Lot get taken captive? Now, they took other people captive too, but Lot is named by the text, and Lot appears to have been the target of the kings of the east when they came into the land of Sodom. Why did they want Lot specifically? Now, I have an answer to this, but I think there's an extremely obvious reason why they would want Lot that really can hit on. Where is Lot himself from? Lot is not a local to Canaan. Lot came with Abraham. Where is Lot from? He's also Mesopotamian. Lot is their bridge between Canaan and Mesopotamia. When they're trying to get in to the land of Mesopotamia, they need somebody who has gone native, somebody from their own place who understands their ways, who they can deal with. But they don't really want Lot. Lot is a second option. He's an acceptable go-between between the land of Mesopotamia and the land of Canaan. But if these kings are really interested in conquering Canaan, they need somebody with influence. They need somebody with power. They need somebody who is there as a leader. And who is that? Not Lot, Avram. Avram. The purpose of taking Lot captive was to allow the kings of Mesopotamia to lure Avram out. He was bait. They didn't want him. It wasn't that they were looking to trade him. They wanted Avram. They wanted Avram to come out and to be on their side. But they come to Sodom and they say, hey, where's Avram? Where's our guy? And he's not there. So they take Lot and they say, Avram, if you want your nephew back, you're going to deal with us. And you're going to show us how you have been so successful here in the land of Canaan. You're going to tell us what your secrets are with these people so that we can replicate it. But Avram is having none of it. And what we have in chapter 14 is a way of understanding why it is that Avram and the kings of Mesopotamia are so drastically different from each other. Avram is not interested in conquest in Canaan. Avram is interested in, I call it evangelism, but what it is establishing the idea of monotheism. He's there spreading ethics. He's there spreading values. He's telling the people. What's that?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek is there already. I'll talk about Melchizedek in just one second. I'll show you the Rashi on that comment. Yeah, he's there because he belongs there. This is the place, and you know what the fight was about with Lot. We'll talk about in just one second. What he's doing is showing the people that there's a better way to live, one which is not focused on conquest, right? And what Avram does is chase them out of the land to where? Where do they go? The place that he chases them to is made very explicit in the text of the Torah in the 14th chapter. Where do they go? Mismola Damasek. What do we call that? Eretz Habashan. The place that they go to is the place that Og ends up taking over. Now we understand something, right? Why is Og brought into this story? What is he doing there? Og belongs in this story because Og is the symbol of the Bashan. Og belongs in this story because Og is the symbol. What is Og trying to do, right? Og comes into the story because he comes and he tells Avram, oh, I'm going to lure you into this battle, right? And I'm going to take Sarai, and reproduce with her, and then I will be the legal claim holder to this land, right? Og is the symbol of power, right? So in this story, we have Avram set up as a conquest through values, and we have Og coming in as an effort to have something which is a conquest through power, but not like these kings who conquer through raw power, through surreptitious dealings, through saying, I already know what the right answer is. I know that I'm supposed to have this, and I just have to figure out how to contrive in such a way to make sure that the judgment lies with me. That's Og holding on to the Teva, saying, I'm going to figure out some way of surviving. That's Og in this story as well. And that is Og and Lot in this story as well. Now, in the story of Lot in chapter 13, what we were told is that Lot wanted to take the land in Canaan for himself. There's a fight between them. What are they fighting about? And this goes back to the point you just made about Melchizedek a second ago. They're fighting about who really is the rightful owner of Canaan. Now, Lot shepherds, not Lot himself, but Lot shepherds say the rightful owner of Canaan is Lot because Abram's going to die. Lot will take it over. And we should just consider this land here, they say, right? This land has been given to Avram, and since he has no heir, Lot will be his heir. Consequently, taking this land for ourselves is not robbery. And Avram tells them that that's not right, right? We can't do that, right? Even though that judgment might make sense, there might be some logic to it, it's not sufficient, right? Now, what's going on here in this conversation? What's going on in the backdrop between Lot and Avram? What's going on in the backdrop between Og and Avram? Why do they have these conversations? Now, let's take one step forward. Right? We looked a moment ago at the Pesukim in Devarim, right? And in Devarim, we were told, Ki mishpat le'elokimhu. Judgment belongs to God. Now, what does that mean? Judgment belonging to God, according to the way that Rambam understands it in the second chapter of Hilchot Sanhedrin, is that, and this is, I don't think it's a major chidush, is that there's something called truth, right? There's a right answer to most questions. You have two people coming in front of you in court, right? And one of them, claims that the other stole $100 from him. Either he did or he didn't, right? There's an answer to that question. And the answer stands irrespective of what the judges say. There's a right answer to that question. If the judges say something other than the right answer, they're lying, right? If the judges calibrate their views to the right answer, then all they are doing is simply validating the thing that is already true. Rambam makes this clear that the judges, they don't really have the facts dictate. That's true in almost every case, right? That's what's happening here as well. Lot says, I know what the right answer is, and therefore we don't have to wait for a due process. We don't have to wait for judgment. And he's wrong, right? But he understands it because he has some sense about where justice is supposed to come from, right? Now, let's imagine that Lot and Avram had gone to Moshe Rabbeinu. They'd gone to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they had said, we are fighting over this land, right? What would Moshe have told them? Lot's shepherds say, in the future, this land is going to belong to us. In the future, this land belongs to, the descendants of Avram. Avram has no descendants. Therefore, inevitably, this is going to be ours. What would Moshe say to them? Is Lot right? Is Avram right? Let me show you something else before I actually give the answer to that question. Look at the language of these psukim here in chapter 13, right? When Avram speaks to Lot, he says, we shouldn't fight. Ki anashim achim anachnu, right? Because we're brothers. Let's go back to our psukim from Devarim that we started with. When Moshe Rabbeinu, that is describing to Bnei Israel how they're supposed to judge, you see what he says over here. Shmua bein achichem ushvatim tzedek bein ish ubein achiv ubein gero. Now think about this for a second, right? Who are these characters? Bein ish ubein achiv ubein gero. There's a certain trend in interpretation that says that many of the psukim in Devarim are not just archetypes, right, where we're just supposed to understand them as Moshe talking about something that might be, but specific callbacks to events from earlier in the Torah. Bein ish ubein achiv ubein gero. Who are the players over here? Well, we know who they are now. There's Avram, his brother, that is to say his relative, Lot, and bein gero, and that foreigner who just is the interloper who ends up in the story, which is Og. And the answer is, you can't know the answer yet. That's what the answer is, right? The answer is we have to wait and see how things fall out because we don't yet know whether Avram is going to have more children. We don't yet know how the story is going to end. So you've got to actually pay attention. You've got to understand that you need to actually follow through the process. How do I know that this is what Moshe Rabbeinu is tending to tell the people? That they need patience above all else. That they need to make sure that they've deduced all the facts before they can come to the point of judgment and not allow the proclivities and the sort of the convenient way to give them the answer. Well, let's go back a couple psukim to what we have in, not far back, just a few psukim back in Devarim. So when Moshe is talking to the people, right, he tells them, there's so many of you now. I can't possibly manage all of you on my own, right? What does he mean? I can't possibly manage all of you on my own, right? So Rashi asked the question, I don't understand what that means, right? Can't Moshe do whatever? Possible Moshe was not able to judge Israel, brought them forth from Egypt, divided the sea for them, made them unfall. He can't judge them? Why not? Well, Rashi gives an answer here, right? The answer that he gives is a little bit hard to understand. Let's look at an elaboration on Rashi's answer here. I don't have the translation of this one. I could have written one, I guess, but I'll just show you the Hebrew of it. This is the commentary of Rav Moshe Feinstein on the Torah. It's called the Darash Moshe. And on this Rashi, he asks the question, I don't understand what Rashi means. And here's what he says, right? Kavana. What is Moshe's intention over here? The Moshe Amar, Af hu, kivan shahayale bechira, hu yarei ma'od milikashel be'eza ta'ut. He says, I also am given free will, right? That's what Moshe says to them. I can't handle everything over here because I am a creature of free will, the same as the rest of you. And you all need to understand, you, Bnei Israel, all need to understand that free will is fundamental to this process. That there's nothing inevitable about history repeating itself. There's nothing inevitable about the trajectory that we're seeing unfold, reaching its logical conclusion. Everyone has free will, and because of that, the only way to really judge is to look through every single one of the details of any case, and then we can really make a choice. Now, why is Moshe highlighting this point here at the beginning of the book of Devarim? I think it goes back to exactly what I said to you at the beginning of this whole presentation. That fundamentally the message of Devarim is that all of us are given bechira chafshit. We're given the option of ubacharta b'chayim, to choose free will, to choose life, the life, as described by the book of the Torah. Who doesn't choose life? Who's on the opposite of this? Who's the one who looks at things as unfolding inevitably? Well, there are those two characters we see before, the fatalistic characters of Lot and especially Og, right? The fatalistic character of Og, who says, the natural trajectory of things after that first, great a triumph of being able to survive the flood is that he's going to end up living forever. And Og is set up as this anti-Moshe, right? Moshe is afraid of him. What's he afraid of? Moshe is afraid not that he can't defeat Og, but that Og is better at manipulating history in his favor than Moshe is. What Moshe is afraid of is that when given choice, he will choose to back down. So let's take this one step further now. And with this, we will conclude because now it's already 9:30. The Torah told us over here, Lo taguru mipnei ish, right? Do not be afraid of rendering judgment no matter what. Oh, why would you be afraid of rendering judgment, right? Ki hamishpat le'elokim hu. What are you going to be afraid of? What the judge needs to be afraid of the most is that he will, as a creature of free will, right, will avoid doing what is necessary in order for truth to come out. We have these two things that are presented as both simultaneously enemies and companions. Free will is necessary in order to approximate the truth, in order to understand what truth is. And the only way that truth can have any meaning is if we arrive at it through our own free will. But at the same time, freedom of choice means that we may arrive at conclusions that are not, in fact, true. And what the message of Sefer Devarim is that we must, at all times, balance these two things. Whether we're dealing in Ben Achiv, or whether it's Ben Gero, whether we're dealing with somebody we're intimidated by or somebody we're not, it doesn't make any difference, right? At all moments in our lives, we are given Bechira Chavshit, and we must always use that to understand that Mishpat Elokim Hu. We are free to choose the right answer, knowing that there is a right answer that we are working towards. On the opposite side of this, we have the destinies of Lot and Og, which is to be written out of history in ways that then become invisible to us, right? There's definitely more to say on this, and on every aspect of what I said over here is really just Roshi Prakim. But as we approach now Tisha B'Av, God willing, this will be a year where we do not mark Tisha B'Av as a fast day, but instead as a day of celebration. Remember that this is yet another year in which we are given the option, right, of saying the world is full of confusing choices, right? But the Torah gives us direction. Ubacharta b'chaim. We should always remember that ours is the choice to choose what is right, knowing that there is something called truth out there, and we must always strive to find it. All right, with that, I'll give you a bracha of Shabbat Shalom, and we should know a geula shlema b'mhera b'yameinu. Any further comments, questions? Does anybody want to share anything? I got something in the chat. All right. Here's more program details of registration. Excellent. I'm sure that will be a fine program. I know that my former colleague here in Stanford, Moshe Kurtz, newly moved to Allentown. He's participating in that, I believe.
Yes.
And I'm sure it'll be an excellent program. Sign up for that. All right.
Yes,
Any final thoughts, questions? Anybody want to share anything?
Anybody?
We dealt with them all during the presentation. Fantastic. All right, Kelman, any final words?
No, thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting.
You
All
were
right.
wonderful.
You didn't post your resources.
Right. 'Cause I don't.
I can.
I don't have them yet. He'll send them.
Oh, I put them in the chat. I put a link to it
Right.
in the chat.
Right. If you send them to me, then we can put it on the website.
All right, sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Why
yeah.
not?
Rabbi
Good.
Wolf?
Yes.
You were wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, you were wonderful. This is the first time that I realized that the fear, not with neither fear nor favor, which used to be the motto of the Department of Justice here, that
Yes, it's a
comes
biblical
from
quote.
here. Very nice.
Fantastic.
Could
Excellent.
you put it in the chat again? They're not in the chat. Can you please
I'll do it right
put
now.
in the
I will do it right now. Chat. Let's see.
Rabbi Kalman,
Yes.
is the program on Sunday also on Zoom?
Yeah, of course it's on Zoom. Yeah. It's on Zoom. Yes.
Can
Yes.
you send me the program?
It's right there in the chat box right now. Just click on the link. It starts at 11 a.m. Eastern. Chana Henkin, Rabbi Chana Henkin is our first speaker, and Moshe Kurtz, Rabbi Moshe Kurtz, who just began in Allentown from Stanford, as Rabbi Wolfe was saying, is our last speaker. And it's Tzvi Gramit. We have Miriam Zami, Marty Luck, Yitzi Blau. We have a great lineup from 11 to 7 Eastern time. I got a couple of complaints from people in Israel. The program ends at 2 in the morning. I said, okay, it's not for me. Like, why did you start at 10 in the morning? I won't have a chance to see any keynote. I have to say a little bit of keynote before I start, like at 11 in the morning. So anyway, so that's it's there. If you have any questions, just email me. But you see it in the chat box, right? So you see it in the
chat box?
Yeah, just look in the chat box and you click on the link and it'll get you right to the program. And you can register there.
Beautiful.
I
All
have
right.
I have a
If
question.
Yes, please.
What you're telling us about Og reappearing throughout the years that we cover in the Torah.
Yeah.
So am I right to ask, is Og reappearing in the centuries and in the present time as well?
Well, no, I mean, so the end of Og's story is there in Bamidbar, right? The end of Og's story is that he dies. Moshe kills him in battle. Seems like Moshe kills him himself personally. It could be that the Torah is just sort of dramatizing it a little bit, and we are just to understand that he dies in battle with Bnei Israel. But his story does end. In the third chapter of Devarim, where we're told about Og's, arso, his bed, which is sometimes understood as his crib, which is to say the bed he slept in as a baby. I think the more standard interpretation is that that's sort of his grave monument, his sarcophagus. So no, Og's story ends. It ends with Moshe, but it begins, according to the Midrash, with Noach. It begins, and maybe even earlier than that. There could be other Midrashim that I'm not familiar with that place him even earlier in the stories of Cain and Hevel or something. He comes out of nowhere and then he's always there. And the point, the straightforward point, just to summarize it very simply, is that Og is forced into the text by history. He doesn't necessarily want to be there. It's not like he's chosen to put himself there, but he understands from the beginning that it is his job to survive no matter what it takes, and he's going to make sure that history is kind to him in that way. And he believes, incorrectly, that when faced against the ultimate arbiter of what freedom of choice means, he will prevail. But it turns out that he's wrong. He dies. He definitely dies. No, I don't think that we should expect to be seeing Og coming around the corner any day soon or rising from the center of the earth. It would be interesting.
No, I didn't mean, I meant it as symbolic.
So
The
this is a good point,
symbolism
and
of
it's worth dwelling on again. The function of Og in these stories, right, is to serve as the source of dread, to be an edifice of fear, right? Fear embodied that or anyone would look at and say, "There's no way that we could possibly overcome this unmovable object." And without a doubt, that message resonates long after the fall of Og. There are other embodiments of it later in Tanakh. I mean, I mentioned Goliath before as another physical giant, but of course, the Herculean tasks, such as they are always there. I think, in the book of Ezra, for instance, when Ezra describes, or maybe even more strongly in the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah describes the city of Yerushalayim as Ir Kivrot Avotai, a city that's filled with nothing but graves. What he's looking at is an impossible situation. He doesn't think that there's any way that Jerusalem can be rebuilt. And it takes enormous courage to make that choice and to say that we know what we're going for. We just have to pursue it. Yeah, I'm totally on board with saying that there is an Og in each generation. It's like I think it was Steve Martin, right? He said, for us, El Guapo. For somebody, El Guapo might be shyness, or their El Guapo maybe I forget the exact line. It's in the Three Amigos. Somebody wants to finish it for me. The advantage of Zoom is that I'm supposed to be able to have access to the stuff on the internet, but I'm not going to search for it right now. Yes, essentially what I'm saying to you is I agree.
Og knows the pre-diluvian law, and that could be his special qualification, knowing in the same way as the Torah of Shem and Ava is the law of the Galut that Yitzhak Avinu wanted Yaakov to learn before he went to Lavan's house.
This is a great question, right?
Yaakov Kamenetsky points that out.
So this is an interesting question, right? Because what the Torah tells us is right? That everything is corrupt. If everything is corrupt, what it implies is that there is a standard of behavior which is expected, right? Now we're accustomed to talking about Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, that the first giving of laws exists not at the time of Noach, not at the before the time of the flood, but after the time of Noach. The B'nai Noach are subject to these laws, but of course Chazal derive it from psukim that are given to Adam, Right? So from those psukim, we derive 6 of the 7 mitzvot, which would imply, as you are saying, that there is something called antediluvian law, right? That there's a world of justice that prevails beforehand. In a similar and not closely related vein, but just because it's on the topic that you're bringing up, the Michad Chinuch, which is a super commentary on the Sefer HaChinuch, which is kind of a commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvot in a certain sense, where when he counts this mitzvah, the mitzvah that I alluded to, Shmoa ben Achichem u'shvatem tzedek, he makes the point of saying that this mitzvah applies to all people on earth. It's not limited to just Bnei Israel. All people, whether Jewish or not Jewish, have to follow this law of being honest and fair and not being intimidated and making the right choices. So I'm not certain that the distinction, because the only change that there is between before the Mabul and after is the existence of Erev Min HaChai. But as far as Mishpat goes, the rule called dinim, right, which is sometimes
But why did
the 7th of the 7
why did Yitzhak Avinu send Yaakov to the yeshiva of Shem and Ava? And that's the question that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asked. And he wanted Yaakov Avinu to know how to behave in Golus.
I think this is a nice idea. Without a doubt, it's a nice idea that there's, the world of confusion, right? The world of the Teva.
All right, the guy went over time.
That
Well,
it's definitely it's a nice idea. And I'm not sure if I would apply it to Og, but I see where you're going. I'll give it some more thought.
He has a 14-year-old who's about
Any further comments before we close out for tonight?
He's been teaching high school.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all very much for joining. God willing, we'll see you again soon.
Okay,